Resident Evil as a franchise has branched into almost every medium of entertainment at this point, between movies, TV shows, Netflix specials, and naturally video games. However, unlike the other two mediums, gaming has a bunch of different verticals inside of it as well, that being of handheld, PC, and console, and mobile gaming if we really want to consider that. I know it's like the biggest corner of the video game market right now, but I digress. And while the three have grown closer together in the latest generation cycle, that wasn't always the case until arguably maybe even the PlayStation Vita. With its ubiquity on all of these consoles, branching out hasn't always yielded the best results, leaving many of these games lost to time, such as the light gun games of Resident Evil Survivor, Resident Evil Gaiden released on the Game Boy Color, and even Resident Evil Outbreak, a bizarre multiplayer experience on PlayStation 1, bringing your friends into the horror as well. So it's no surprise when Capcom announced in 2010 a Resident Evil game for the 3DS, bringing the survival horror to the 3D handheld, that being Resident Evil Revelations. Being headed up by Koshi Nakamichi, excuse the pronunciations here, the gameplay designer of Resident Evil 5, what we get here is a semi-return to form surprisingly, while keeping with the gameplay and changes and system designs that we saw in Resident Evil 5 and subsequently 6, and something which I think is actually a pretty neat package. And while the 3DS release was met with pretty high regard, the re-releases on newer consoles were less so, an aspect that we'll be getting into later in the video. Taking a slight detour from the core games in the series, let's take a look at Resident Evil Revelations, what it did right, and what was kind of a miss here. As always, if you're into content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel, and if you like this video, be sure to leave a like as well. It all helps with getting this video out to more people and will be much appreciated. I did play the re-releases that were released on Steam, as I had a broken 3DS and I didn't want to even attempt to do emulation for this one, so keep that with lens in mind. With that, let's get into the breakdown of Resident Evil Revelations, continuing our Resident Evil series as a whole. The last 7 or so videos, we've seen the transition of Resident Evil from a slower paced corridor crawler in the first 3 to an over-the-shoulder, fast-paced action focus of the latter 3, with Code Veronica in the middle, leaning more towards the prior Resident Evil games. Revelations in its core game design attempts to thread the needle between the two styles, one which I think was more or less achieved. Coming off of the back of Resident Evil 5, movement and shooting feel quite similar to that game, even a bit slower at times due to the lack of a sprint button. This was maybe my biggest quibble with Revelations, as much akin to the old Resident Evil games. You're doing a ton of backtracking after unlocking a door or finding a key, making the trudge through old areas kind of a slog, especially when enemies don't respawn here. When it comes to the firearms, these feel pretty solid as well, powerful but not broken as weapons we get in 4 and 5. Upgrading weapons are gone as well, replacing that with a mod part system. Finding these parts in the world can be attached to your weapons to strengthen or change how they work entirely, from boosting reload speed or damage to creating a charge up weapon of sorts, making holding the trigger down longer doing more damage as a charge shot. I like this system in upgrading weapons a lot, as it gives that choice to the player on how they want their firearm to actually function, while not overall breaking the entire gun. While upgrading works in the same way, you could in theory dump all of your money into one weapon, creating this basically a one-shot kill gun. Whereas with this mod system, there's only a certain amount of mod slots on each weapon, meaning you can't completely juice out a pistol to just one-tap everything that walks. These mods can be equipped at a weapons box as well, meaning you need to make your way back to one of these in order to change your loadout, or hold off until you find one further down the path. As a system, I love making these sorts of choices, where each are viable, but in taking that choice, you're sacrificing another. Binary upgrades are nice in creating the power fantasy that these games wield, but the power of choice in how you want to actually upgrade your guns, rather than just due to reload speed, damage, or ammo capacity, leaves these decisions in your hands, empowering you to make that decision. To me, that's a far more interesting choice to make rather than just putting money into a single weapon. But other than that, the core mechanics are basically the same as we've seen in all the other games so far. Quick turns, we can actually aim while we move. We have a companion, but he doesn't really do all that much, but I think that's okay in this game. But on the gameplay front, those are the biggest changes that we see here, and ones that I actually kind of appreciate, minus the lack of a sprint button. The other main mechanic introduced in Revelations is one that I'm actually really mixed on though, that being the scanning mechanic. In the tutorial section on the beach, you're introduced to the Gamma Scanner, a virtual handheld scantron that analyzes samples of bioweapons throughout the game. Doing so will reward the player with another herb, and restarting the percentage once again. In lore, this actually makes a lot of sense for the BSA agents to carry around with them, their main occupation being that of combating bioterrorism, and as I learned from Schoolhouse Rock back in the day, However, the practical implications of this device are completely scattershot, being useless on one hand and vital, albeit annoying, in the other. Let me explain. The scanner's main purpose, as it's introduced, is to analyze biotissue. You aim at the thing, hold the trigger, it dings, and you move on, not unlike the photo system in Bioshock 1. However, hitting 100% on the gauge nets you only a single herb, and while this can come into clutch if you're out or low on health, in general, this incentive really isn't anything all that special if you have two thumbs and mild hand-eye coordination. While also finding herbs in the world and only having a max capacity of 5, the need to keep scanning by the middle of the game is essentially gone. The scanner now being used for other purposes, and maybe one that is a little annoying if not slightly overtuned. You see, the scanner can also detect hidden items in the world as well, from ammo to mods to even, more herb. And while Revelations on the surface seems kind of skimp on ammo, if you're using the scanner often, and by often I mean every time you enter a new room, you can find more than enough ammo and equipment stashed in all sorts of corners, shelves, and behind geometry in the world over each entire level. And while you may go, yay, more stuff, I began to have flashbacks of playing Arkham Asylum upon release. Arkham Asylum incorporated a mechanic known as Detective Mode, allowing Batman to see all of his enemies through walls, their vitals, and everywhere that he could hide or blow up. Meaning, because of how powerful this mechanic was in the world of Arkham, you would actively be making combat harder on yourself if you didn't play with this quote-unquote filter on the entire time, making the dark, gritty Batman adventure feel like a well-rendered voxel game. Batman, even today, is a stunning game to look at, is taken away by the need to constantly be using detective vision, or else you're just severely gimping yourself. The use of the scanner in Revelations here has much of the same effect. This time a laborious forest green coats the screen as you scramble to find any hidden casings tucked in the corner only visibly picked up by the scanner. This was the craze in gaming after Batman Arkham Asylum came out, to have a quote-unquote better vision mode, or something that you can use to find secrets in the world. But in creating these, took away from the entire look of the game and replacing it with this monochrome information and stuff finding filter. I'm glad that we really stopped doing this in games now, as to me it just detracts from the work done on the visuals, which is a crying shame. Speaking of visuals, I'm going to be honest here, this game is not necessarily a looker in all regards, but for a reason that actually makes a lot of sense. As mentioned before, Revelations was originally built as a 3DS game, and it shows. I do remember playing this back in the day on my old 3DS, and remember this game actually looking really good on the handheld. But much like how any game that is upscaled to a larger screen format, everything just looks slightly off in this version. Textures aren't as detailed, lighting doesn't look the way it should, and character models look more like dolls than what we're used to in games even at the time. And while necessarily bad as graphics aren't everything, nothing just, looks really right to me, much like how I felt Diablo Immortal looked when being ported over to PC, seeing as how that was a mobile game at first as well, as these details are not fleshed out due to having the small screen size. It's not ugly per se, but it didn't really age all that well. It's hard to have a severe knock against it given the fact that it was originally a 3DS game, but I felt the need to mention it if you're a newcomer to the game or to the series as a whole, just so you guys know what to expect. We also see the remnants of the on-the-go experience come out as well in the flow of the game itself. Revelations being broken up into episodes much like a TV show experience. This was done to allow for logical breakpoints in the flow of the game in order to have a more stop-and-go experience that is conducive for playing games on a handheld, even incorporating recaps of prior events after each episode. While I like this system and feels like it works really well in a handheld space, this stop-and-go experience really breaks the flow of the gameplay, each episode lasting for about 10 to 20 minutes at the most, with 12 episodes in total. This holdover style choice was probably a godsend for handheld gaming, really hurt the pacing as someone who just likes to play through these games in a few sittings at best whenever I can. Pacing can make or break a game in some instances, and while not affecting to the point of actually hating this game, this really took me out of the experience at every breakpoint, and there's a lot of them, as there's sub-chapters in every episode. When porting this to consoles and PC, I do think that these breaks maybe should have been taken out, but as this is almost a straight port over, as we can tell from the menus as well, they look really handheldy. It was probably more dev time than deemed actually necessary during the porting process, a choice which, as a business owner myself, understand completely. But while there's a ton of handheld stink on this game, it wasn't detrimental to the experience for me in the slightest. Long have I complained in the last 3 videos of the loss of identity in Resident Evil up until this point, and even when making those videos, I think I inadvertently stumbled on something that truly allows survival horror games to stand out, to be a cut above the rest. And looking at the differences between Resident Evils 1 and 2 compared to 3, 4, and 5, minus a few gameplay tweaks obviously, the other main change is the setting or lack thereof in certain cases. Introducing the Queen Zenobia, the setting of Resident Evil Revelations, and the main reason why I think this game is pretty damn good. Akin to the first 2 games in the series, Revelations takes place on one singular location for a bulk of the game, minus a few side tangents here and there which we'll get to in the story, making this ship becoming a character of its its own. Think back to the Spencer Manor at the police station in the first 2 games. These areas are iconic due to the fact that the entirety of the game takes place in this one location, learning its layout, its secrets, and the lore, all while surviving and working your way through puzzles and doors to make your escape from the evils within. While globe-trotting in 4 and 5 is fun and keeps the visuals interesting, you lose the oppression created by the cramped corridors, locked rooms, and the sense of accomplishment in making your way through new areas of the space, as well as the satisfaction of retaining all of the knowledge that you've had running through this place before. The Queen Zenobia fits the bill, being a ship stuck out at sea, and honestly is maybe one of the most interesting settings the series has been in so far. Isolation in a house is one thing, but being isolated on a ship in the middle of an ocean with no way of escaping is a far more terrifying setting. Being trapped in the middle of the ocean to me is a terrifying place to be, as even if you escape the confines of the ship, there's really nowhere else to go after that, seeing as one can't swim that far or long without making it to land. And even with the changings of the setting, this game still has the more action-focused side that we've come to know from the recent Resident Evil games, but taking place in the tight hallways makes everything still feel dangerous, much akin to the first 2 games. Not knowing what's around any corner, navigating your way through cramped corridors and locked rooms, it's a feeling that was lost in the last outings of Resident Evil. And while I've been railing against the action of these games, maybe what I was really railing against was the setting itself. This game did change that outlook for me a lot, realizing that the blend of the 2 styles can easily be achieved to make a more satisfying play experience, one that plays actually mildly well while also keeping the feelings that the first 2 games had. Now, I never finished Revelations before this playthrough, and while the story is definitely over the top, as we will see later in the video, and like every other game in the series thus far, playing through the Queen Zenobia here is a much more engaging experience, something which I feel was sorely lacking in games like 5 and 6. We still have sequences in different areas focusing more on the murdering of ton of biomutants, but every time I was taken back to the ship was a treat to play through, making the Queen Zenobia one of my favorite areas in the Resident Evil series as a whole. Taking it back to the close encounters did wonders for me in this game, but am I alone in that? Am I completely off base with this take? Let me know if my theory and thought processes is on the right track in the comments down below. I'm curious to hear what my fellow Resident Evil fanatics feel about this. Enemy variety here in Revelations is both gross and, if I'm being honest, a bit lacking. We all know Resident Evil for their zombies, mutated animals, and things like hunters and lickers. In later entries, we see the zombification turning more into a parasite of infecting the host and turning it into its mutated form, like we see in 4, 5, and 6. Revelations takes a different approach to its fodder enemies, known as the Ooze. These white amalgamous blobs, taking different forms for different functions, look more like melting clay or formed semen that stalk the halls of the Queen Zenobia. These guys, honestly, really suck in my opinion, and are the biggest detractor for me in this game. While I don't find zombies inherently scary, the Ooze enemies honestly just kind of made me laugh at this point. Looking like the Michelin Man stood out in the sun for too damn long and got thrust on a boat. And with this being the most common enemy that we see, and there are a lot of them, some with shields, some with ranged attacks, others with Ooze swords. We also have the hunters making its return here as well, which is, in this fidelity, look more like the raptors from Jurassic Park rather than the foreboding bioweapons that they were in the first games. We also have some underwater demon fish in the flooded decks below, which kind of just look like bonefish and are highly annoying to fight against. The boss fights here also kind of suck as well, with just a mutated lady here, a giant blob there. There really is no interesting ones here, minus the one with the Ooze monster at the very end, that being having surrounded the ship the entire time. This fight consists of blowing back the reforming tentacles over and over again, and while not a fun fight per se, is at least visually interesting. Plus there's lots of rocket launchers which you can use, which really lends to that power fantasy that Resident Evil has always been going for. I feel like there could have been something different and more ominous than the Ooze, and I'm glad these guys have never been back in the series in this form again. With all that outside stuff out of the way though, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the narrative of Resident Evil Revelations. We open Revelations with returning protagonist Jill Valentine riding through the waves of the Mediterranean on a boat heading towards a ship, the Queen Zenobia, the location of the last known coordinates of the missing Chris Redfield. Accompanied by her partner, Parker Luciana, the two agents of the BSAA make their way on board, weaving their way through the cramped halls of the abandoned cruise ship. Taking place between the events of Resident Evils 4 and 5, this game focuses on the agents of the BSAA and their rise in becoming the prominent organization we see them in Resident Evil 5. And while Jill and Parker are the pair we spend the most time with, there are a cadre of characters we interact with as well. Chris is a known quantity, so I'm not going to delve much more into him, but he's accompanied by new partner Jessica Schwerwatt, whose main character trait involves being obsessed with Chris and not wearing the appropriate clothes for the current predicaments, needing to show off as much skin as possible. I'll be honest, she just kind of sucks and is like completely shallow. I feel like there could have been a lot more done with her, but whatever, Capcom, thanks. As we will learn in time, Parker and Jessica were both agents of the FBC, or the Federal Bioterrorism Commission. Parker is likable enough with his sense of justice always being pointed in the right direction, and while cracking wise, still goes out of his way to make sure that his partners are safe no matter the situation. We learn that these two are partners together during the Terra Grigia incident, another main thread that we will see come up time and time again in weird commercials, newscasts, and flashback scenes to the fall of the city. Essentially, Terra Grigia was a city built in the middle of the Mediterranean, a green city run solely on green energy, utilizing focused sunbeams from a satellite, and a safe haven for those who want to live there. However, the city fell victim to a bioterrorism attack perpetrated by the terrorist group Il Veltro, with hunters flocking the city in an effort to cause panic. In a last-ditch effort to contain the outbreak, the city was destroyed using the Regia Solis, a satellite used that focused the sun's energy beams that was given the power to the city, turning this city of the future into complete rubble. We also meet O'Brien, head of the BSAA, who was also a part of the FBC during the Terra Grigia incident alongside Morgan Lansdale, the current head of the FBC. O'Brien plays a major role later on, but for now he's just known as our CO for this mission. We also have fellow BSAA agents Keith Lumley and Quint Ketchum, also known as Jackass. These two are fellow BSAA intel agents, Jackass being a savant with technology, but honestly I absolutely despise these two. As the attempt of comic relief in this game, these two are a complete miss on the mark for me. And if we're being honest, if they weren't in the game at all, there probably would be no difference in the story that couldn't be handled by any of the other cast. They honestly drive me up a wall anytime we have to play as them, and thankfully it's only about 3 times and we never see them in the series again. While they do play a role on information gathering on locations of ships and information on Lansdale, that's really the only point they play, and I can't really see why they're even in this game at all, so we're just kind of gonna leave them up here. And with the players on the field, let's get into the plot, one of which is convoluted to say the least. Jill and Parker land on the boat, and while navigating the abandoned hallways, see Chris locked in a room tied to a chair. As Jill moves to unlock the door, we are introduced to the Ooze, and upon entering the said room, discover this isn't really Chris, but a dummy plant to lure the pair into the room, being knocked out by a masked figure with toxic gas, reportedly to be a part of Veltro, the terror cell responsible for the Terra Grigia incident. Meanwhile, Chris and Jessica are in the mountains of Europe investigating a Veltro base hidden away in the mountains. As Chris and Jessica make their way there, O'Brien calls them to inform Chris of Jill and Parker having gone missing in the Mediterranean, which, given how Jill was sent to find Chris there is obviously something deeper going on. Chris and Jessica are redeployed to go find Jill and Parker, while Keith and Jackass are sent to the base. Chris just left to pull in the information from the Veltro servers. Going back to Jill, she wakes up in the cabin on the ship, stripped of all of her weapons and gear, and is contacted by Parker saying that they should be syncing up on the bridge. The two do link up, find their gear, and head to the bridge after combating the Ooze all over the ship to find a video outlining Veltro's plans, that being to infect the world with the T-Abyss virus via the water supplies in the ocean as revenge against the FBC for murdering a ton of them during the Terra Grigia event. They are then attacked by FBC agent Raymond, who, given his hair and creepily shaped head, is obviously not on the up and up. In an attempt to call for help, Jill and Parker move to locate another terminal to open communications and call for help, but in doing so learn that Lansdale, still head of the FBC, is planning on activating the Regis Solis in order to take out the ship, erasing any evidence of the FBC's involvement with the Terra Grigia incident. The pair move at the behest of O'Brien to the front of the ship, where a UAV armed with chaff grenades is located, able to mask the signal of the ship from the satellite scanner, and with the pair successful in this, stave off imminent death, but the subsequent wave of the laser leaves the ship flooding from down below. At the same time, Chris and Jessica land on what they think is the Queen Zenobia, navigating the ooze within, only to find that they are on the sister ship, the Queen Samarias, the wrong ship altogether, albeit with the exact same layout. They escape via boat and head towards the correct ship, contending with the giant tentacle monster under the water along the way. Upon reaching the ship, the two pairs meet in the casino, only to be confronted by the masked Veltro agent, who goes off on a long spiel about something deeper going on behind the scenes of the incident. However, before this information can actually be spilled, Jessica shoots the agent, only for him to be revealed as Raymond, the bad-haired guy we met earlier. Parker moves over to help him, as they do have a history, but as Raymond dies, he whispers something into Parker's ear. Our four heroes decide to split once again, Chris and Jill working together to find and stop the T-Abyss virus from spreading, while Parker and Jessica work to find their way to stop the ship from sinking due to the flooding down below. Let's focus on Jessica and Parker for a moment, as the two make their way to the bridge, as Parker decides that he's going to confront Jessica, as Raymond has informed him that she was really an FBC mole working against the BSAA all along. Raymond ends up pulling up, joining in the standoff, not actually dead due to a Kevlar vest, and as the two bicker on what they actually are going to do with Jessica, she shoots Parker in the chest and activates the self-destruct sequence on the ship and boogies on out. We leave seeing Parker and Raymond attempting to escape. Focusing back on Chris and Jill, the two reach the lab in the ship, only to be contacted by Lansdale, who spills the beans on the FBC and Veltro actually working together to cause the Terra Grigia incident from before, in order for the FBC to gain more funding and unfettered power to operate as they see fit. He also informs them that he also had a cure for the T-Abyss virus manufactured on the ship as well, and once delivered to him, murdered the scientists on the deck. The two destroy the virus as the ship begins to explode. Jill and Chris find Parker limping under the deck on their way to the helicopter to escape, and as they try to help him out, the catwalk below Parker drops. In a touching scene where Parker basically tells them to let him go so that way they can escape, an explosion occurs and he falls to his death, essentially sacrificing himself to ensure Jill and Chris could make the run to the helicopter and survive. Upon getting on board the helicopter, they are contacted by O'Brien, who tells the pair that this entire operation has actually been a ruse conducted by him in order to gather evidence on Lansdale's involvement with the Terra Grigia incident and working with Veltro, which naturally is now sitting on the sinking and molten hot ship that just exploded. He also informs the duo of the Queen Dido, a third ship in the fleet located under the rubble of Terra Grigia, which may hold some evidence to Lansdale's involvement. As Chris and Jill reroute to the remains of the ship, Lansdale appears in the BSAA headquarters and arrests O'Brien and takes control of the BSAA, leaving Chris and Jill essentially flying blind. On board the Queen Dido, the pair find Jack Norman, the lead of Veltro, having been stuck after being betrayed by Lansdale, and is now infected with the T-Abyss virus. He injects himself with more virus, and after the mutation and subsequent defeat, they find a video recorded by Norman spilling all the information of the group working with Lansdale and the FBC to commit the atrocities over at the Terra Grigia event. Chris and Jill broadcast this back to BSAA HQ, and with this information now public, Lansdale is arrested and O'Brien is back in control. However, as we see at the end, he steps down due to a sacrificial plan and involvement in the Queen Zenobia mission. We also learn that Parker is not actually dead, having been rescued by Raymond, and he goes back to the BSAA as well to continue working. Raymond, however, has also seemingly been triple-crossing everybody with Jessica, as we see the two meet up in a cafe to hand off a sample of the T-Abyss virus to her, explaining he has his own reasons why he decided to rescue Parker off of the ship. We end this title with Chris and Jill walking up to the Spencer Manor, the beginning of Resident Evil 5's DLC, Lost in Nightmares, and we fade to black on this. This campaign is an absolute doozy, as there is a lot going on here, thanks to the focus on literally 9 different characters. While Jill and Chris's campaigns are fairly straightforward and fine on their own, the inclusion of the betrayal of O'Brien by concealing the true goals of the mission and entrapping Lansdale makes this plot way more confusing than it needs to be. This game's story essentially plays out like a giant spy novel, with double-crossing and triple-crossing, hidden intentions in everyone's agendas, minus the pawns consisting of Jill, Chris, and Parker. What began as a simple mission to locate a friend turns into a web of deceit, backstabbing, betrayal, and more. The inclusion of Jessica and Raymond also being double or triple agents depending on how you look at it, but really working together at the very end add a whole layer of confusion to the story, more than there should have been in my opinion. I do think that the Jill side of this story is pretty solid for a Resident Evil game, being the fish out of water and trying to figure out a way off of this ship from hell. However, the overarching focus of this game serves in providing more backstory for the BSAA as a whole, given how we see its rise to power after these events leading into 5, a goal that I think does actually get achieved here. Learning more about the organizations at play in the world does a lot to flesh out the lore of Resident Evil going forward, seeing the full power of the BSAA from its infancy at work, only to have it juxtaposed next to the massive PMC-like organization that we see in 5. All in all, while a bit convoluted and not necessary to the overarching story of Resident Evil in the main line, this side story is still pretty solid, and while not necessarily a must-play, does shed a lot of light on our heroes that we've been following and will continue to follow in the next entries in the series. But what did you guys think of Resident Evil Revelations? Was it a solid entry or skip? Let me know in the comments down below. I do engage with almost all of them down there, and as always, just try and keep it civil with each other. I get that tensions run high when people say that they don't like the game that you like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. If you like this video and are new to the channel, consider subscribing for more content like this. And if you like this video, definitely leave a like, and most of all, go ahead and share it with your friends, because as they always say, sharing is caring. For all my new viewers, thank you for stopping by, and for all my returning ones, thank you for coming back. Next up is Revelations 2, before we delve back into this main numbered entry series, and then move on to the remakes after that. So stay tuned for that here real soon. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.